My stepmother's voice was a needle, and my heart was the pincushion she used to keep it sharp. "You must understand, Elara, it is for the best. To have you lurking in the main thoroughfares would only confuse our guests. They come to see beauty, to see life. A quiet corner's the most suitable place well, for you." She did not need to finish the sentence. I was the ellipsis, the trailing thought best left unspoken. I was the color of invisibility, a shade she had painstakingly painted me in over the last decade. Tonight was the Midwinter Gala, the zenith of the social season, held this year at the Duke of Blackwood's palatial estate. It was an event of such staggering importance that even my presence was deemed mandatory, if only as a technicality to prove my father, Lord Atherton, had not entirely misplaced one of his daughters. While my stepsister, Rosalind, was being laced into a gown of celestial blue silk that shimmered like a captured star, I was handed a dress the color of dishwater gray. It was one of Rosalind's old gowns, altered poorly, the seams puckering with resentment. It hung on my frame not as a garment, but as a shroud for a life not yet lived. My father, a man constructed of good intentions and weak mortar, simply nodded at Isolde's pronouncements. "A quiet corner sounds very sensible, my dear. Elara does so enjoy her observations." He said it as if he were praising a peculiar hobby, like collecting moss or studying insects. He saw my silence not as a cage, but as a preference. It was easier for him that way. It required nothing of him. Rosalind, beautiful and bright and utterly oblivious, floated into my room, a vision of azure and diamonds. "Oh, Elara, are you ready? Isn't it all terribly exciting?" She twirled, her skirts whispering against the threadbare rug. She did not notice my dress, or if she did, her mind did not register its drabness as anything other than my natural state. I was the plain, dark frame that made her own gilded portrait shine all the brighter. There was no malice in her, only a profound, almost celestial lack of awareness. She lived in the sun. I was a creature of the shadows it cast. Her kindness was a casual, unthinking thing, like a queen tossing a coin to a beggar she would forget in the next instant. "I am ready," I said, my own voice sounding foreign in the small, dim room. It was a room at the back of the house overlooking the Mews, my mother's room before she had died, and my father had sought the vibrant, demanding presence of Lady Isolde to fill the silence. Isolde had filled the silence, yes. She had filled it with her laughter, her pronouncements, her constant, subtle campaign to erase me. The corner she had chosen for me was a small alcove behind a riot of overgrown ferns, tucked away near the musicians' gallery. From here, I had a skewed but comprehensive view of the grand ballroom. I was a ghost at the feast, present but unseen, a silent chronicler of an evening I was not truly a part of. Isolde had given me my instructions with the crisp finality of a general deploying a forgotten piece of artillery to a useless flank. "Stay here. Do not wander. If anyone should happen to speak to you, be brief. We wouldn't want to bore them." So I stayed. I watched the glittering tide of society flow into the ballroom, a river of jewels and silk. I saw Rosalind, immediately surrounded, her laugh like the chiming of tiny bells. I saw my father and stepmother, masters of the social current, navigating the room with practiced smiles. And I, in my gray dress, became one with the stone and shadow of the alcove. But from this forgotten vantage, I could see what others missed. I could see the architecture. The ballroom of Blackwood Manor was a masterpiece of Palladian design, a symphony of symmetry and light. My secret, fervent passion was architecture. In a world that judged me on my plain face and quiet demeanor, the logic and beauty of a well-designed building was a sanctuary. I sketched in secret. I read forbidden treatises on engineering and form that I had to bribe a page to acquire for me. It was the one part of my soul Isolde had never found, and therefore never been able to tarnish. I looked up at the magnificent cantilevered balcony that ringed the upper level, a feat of engineering that seemed to defy gravity. I noted the intricate coffered ceiling, the way the light from the thousand-candled chandeliers played upon the gilded plasterwork. I was not at a ball. I was in a temple, and I was content to be a forgotten supplicant. Then, a change occurred in the room's atmosphere. A hush fell, a subtle shift in the collective energy. The tide of conversation parted. The majordomo's voice, deep and resonant, boomed through the hall. His Grace, the Duke Alistair Vane. I had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. The Duke of Vane was a legend, a myth cloaked in black broadcloth, immensely wealthy, impossibly powerful, and notoriously reclusive since a family tragedy years ago. He was spoken of in whispers, a man of granite and shadow who rarely emerged from his northern fortress. His presence here was as shocking as a snowstorm in July. He entered, and the room seemed to shrink around him. He was not handsome in the way of the pretty young lords who flocked around Rosalind. His face was all harsh angles and stark planes, as if carved from unforgiving rock. His eyes, a startlingly pale gray, missed nothing. He was a monolith of a man, dressed in severe, impeccable black that absorbed the light around him. He moved with a stillness, an economy of motion that spoke of immense contained power. He acknowledged the host with a curt nod, his expression unreadable, and then his gaze began to sweep the room. It was a slow, deliberate survey. I watched as his eyes passed over the glittering diamonds, the hopeful smiles, the preening beauties. He looked at Rosalind, his gaze resting on her for a moment, and I saw Isolde stiffen with ambition, her hand tightening on my father's arm. But the Duke's eyes moved on, dismissive, searching. And then, impossibly, they stopped. They stopped on my forgotten corner, on the shadowed alcove choked with ferns. They stopped on me. For a heart-stopping moment, I was certain I was mistaken. He must be looking at the musicians above me or at the tapestry behind me. But his focus was direct, unwavering. The world seemed to fall away, the music, the chatter, the heat of the room. There was only the weight of that pale, assessing gaze. Then he began to move. He did not stroll. He did not meander. He walked. He cut a straight, deliberate path through the glittering crowd, which parted before him like the Red Sea. Whispers followed him, a rustling wake of confusion and astonishment. He ignored them all. He ignored the hopeful glances, the subtle curtsies, the outstretched hands of acquaintances. His destination was fixed. His destination was me. My breath caught in my throat. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was a mistake, a terrible public mistake. He had confused me for someone else. Isolde would be apoplectic. I shrank back further into the shadows, wishing the stone wall behind me would simply swallow me whole. But he did not stop. He came to a halt just before the ferns, the tips of his polished black boots inches from the hem of my gray dress. The entire ballroom had fallen silent. The musicians, sensing the shift, had let their instruments fall quiet. 1,000 pairs of eyes were fixed on this bizarre tableau, the most powerful man in the kingdom and the invisible girl in the corner. He looked at me, his face impassive. I could not breathe. I waited for the dismissal, the realization of his error, the curt turn on his heel. Instead, he spoke, his voice low but carrying with absolute clarity in the sudden silence. "The balcony," he said, his gaze lifting for a moment to the marvel of engineering above us. "It is a remarkable example of a hidden cantilever, but the load must be distributed through the primary wall. Do you believe they used a concealed iron tie rod system common after the Great Fire, or a more classical Kentish post and beam counterweight integrated into the floor joists of the upper gallery?" The world tilted on its axis. The question was precise, technical, and aimed directly at the secret core of my being. It was a question no one in this room could have answered. It was a question no one but me would have even understood. I stared at him, my mind a frantic blank. This could not be happening. He waited, his patience a palpable force. He did not seem to notice the hundreds of gaping onlookers. He was simply a man who had asked a question and was awaiting an answer. The silence stretched, becoming a tangible thing. I could feel Isolde's fury burning a hole in my back from across the room. I had to speak. I found my voice, a thin, reedy thing I barely recognized. "A tie rod system would create too much lateral tension on a wall of this age, Your Grace," I managed, the words tasting of dust. "The stone is too friable. It would have to be a counterweight system. You can see if you look at the parquetry in the antechamber above, the floor is raised by almost a full foot, likely to conceal the weighted beams." A flicker of something, not a smile, but a spark of interest, lit his severe eyes. He gave a single sharp nod. I had thought so. The masonry bears no stress marks. You have a good eye, Miss Atherton, I whispered. Elara Atherton. Miss Atherton, he repeated, the name a solid, definite thing on his tongue. He gave another curt nod as if our transaction was complete, and then, as abruptly as he had arrived, he turned and walked away, leaving me in the wreckage of the ballroom's collective astonishment. The silence shattered, replaced by a tidal wave of frantic, disbelieving whispers. I stood frozen in my alcove, my hand pressed to my chest, feeling the frantic beat of a heart that had just been seen for the very first time. The carriage ride home was a study in glacial fury. Isolde sat opposite me, her face a mask of rage so cold it seemed to lower the temperature of the small space. My father wrung his hands, muttering about unprecedented events, while Rosalind looked from her mother to me with a wide, confused gaze. What did you do? Isolde's voice was a venomous hiss, all pretense of civility stripped away now that we were beyond public scrutiny. What trick did you play to draw his attention? Did you stumble? Did you feign a fainting spell? I did nothing, I said, my voice barely audible over the clatter of the wheels. He walked over and asked me a question. A question about what? She demanded. What could he possibly have to ask you? The emphasis on the final word was a slap. About the ballroom's construction, I replied. She stared at me, her eyes narrowing. You are lying. You have concocted some scheme, some pathetic bid for attention to ruin Rosalind's evening. You will be confined to your room for a week. Perhaps that will teach you to stay in your place. I did not argue. There was no point. In her world, I was incapable of attracting any notice that was not pitiful or malicious. The idea that the Duke of Vane might have seen something of value in me was so antithetical to her understanding of the universe that she could only process it as a conspiracy. I retreated into the silence she had built for me, but for the first time, it felt different. It was not a prison. It was a shelter where I could replay the scene again and again, hoarding the memory of his question, of the brief, startling moment of being seen. 2 days later, a footman from Vane House delivered a thick cream-colored envelope on a silver tray. My stepmother snatched it before the butler could even announce its arrival. Her manicured nail slit the ducal seal. Her face shifted through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, and finally, incandescent rage. He has invited you to tea, she said, her voice strangled. She thrust the card at me. His Grace, the Duke of Vane, requests the pleasure of Miss Elara Atherton's company for tea. Thursday at 3 o'clock. It was stark, formal, and utterly confounding. You cannot go, she declared. She must, my father said, his voice surprisingly firm. He was a weak man, but he was not a fool. To refuse a direct invitation from the Duke of Vane was a social slight of such magnitude it would ruin them. Isolde, we have no choice. And so I went. Isolde spent the intervening days in a state of simmering fury, insisting on chaperoning me herself, as if I might otherwise abscond with the Duke's silverware. She coached me relentlessly. Say as little as possible. Let me do the talking. Smile, but not too broadly. Do not offer any opinions. For heaven's sake, Elara, try not to be yourself. Vane House was not a home. It was a statement. A vast, imposing edifice of granite and slate that seemed to command the entire square. It was severe, elegant, and radiated an aura of immense quiet power, much like its owner. We were shown into a library that stole my breath away. It was a cathedral of books, 2 stories high, with shelves stretching to a vaulted ceiling painted with constellations. A rolling ladder rested against one wall, and the air smelled of old paper, leather, and beeswax. In the center of the room, before a fireplace large enough to roast an ox, sat the Duke. He rose as we entered, a towering figure against the firelight. He gave Isolde a cool, dismissive nod, then turned his full attention to me. Miss Atherton, thank you for coming. Isolde immediately launched into a torrent of saccharine pleasantries, positioning herself between us like a battleship. Your Grace, we were so honored to receive your invitation. Such a magnificent home you have. Rosalind, my beautiful daughter, was so disappointed she could not join us. A prior engagement, you understand. The Duke let her talk, his face impassive. He waited for her to run out of breath, then simply said, Mrs. Gable will show you to the blue salon, Lady Atherton. Tea and cakes are prepared for you there." It was not a suggestion. It was a command. He was dismissing my chaperone. A stout woman in a black dress with a key ring at her waist appeared as if summoned from the ether. Mrs. Gable, the loyal retainer. Her face was as stern as her master's, but her eyes, when they briefly met mine, held a flicker of something that might have been curiosity. Isolde's mouth opened and closed like a fish. To be so blatantly sidelined was an insult of the highest order, but one she could not protest. Fuming, she allowed herself to be led from the room, casting a final warning glare at me over her shoulder. The great oak doors closed behind her, and I was alone with the Duke of Vane. The silence he left in his wake was vast and unnerving. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to a worn leather armchair opposite his own. I did, perching on the edge of the cushion, my hands clenched in my lap. I was terrified. I kept running through the possible reasons for this meeting. Was it pity? Was he some eccentric collector of oddities, and I was his latest acquisition? Was this some cruel, elaborate joke? He did not sit immediately. He walked to a large mahogany desk and picked up a thin academic journal. He held it out to me. "I believe this is yours." I looked at it. It was a copy of Architectural Quarterly. My heart stopped. I'd published a series of essays in it over the past year, treatises on Gothic vaulting and the structural integrity of Roman aqueducts. I had submitted them under the pseudonym E.A., terrified of being discovered. It was my only outlet, my one small act of rebellion. I don't know what you mean," I stammered. "Your analysis of the fan vaulting at King's College Chapel was revelatory," he continued, ignoring my denial. "You argued that the design was not merely decorative, but a load-bearing structure of immense sophistication, something most scholars dismiss. You have a formidable mind, Miss Atherton. It is a rare thing." He knew. He had not singled me out at the ball by chance. He had seen my name on the guest list, made the connection to the anonymous author he admired, and had sought me out. It was not my face, my station, or my family that had drawn his attention. It was my mind. The part of me I had thought was most invisible was the only thing he had seen. A strange, unfamiliar emotion welled up in my chest. It was a painful, terrifying sensation. It was hope. I had spent a decade building walls around my heart to protect it, and this man, with a few quiet words, had just breached them all. "Why?" I whispered, the single word encompassing a universe of questions. Why seek me out? Why read such an obscure journal? Why care? He finally sat down, the leather groaning under his weight. He steepled his long fingers, his pale eyes fixed on my face. "Because," he said, his voice low and serious, "I find intelligence to be of more lasting value than polished conversation or a pretty face. Your family, it seems, does not share my assessment." It was a simple statement of fact, devoid of pity, but it struck me with the force of a physical blow. He saw not only me, but the dynamics of my prison. We spoke for an hour. He asked me about my theories, challenged my assumptions, listened with an unnerving intensity as I haltingly explained my ideas. For the first time in my life, I was not being tolerated or dismissed. I was being engaged. I was being heard. As I spoke, the timid, hesitant girl began to fall away, replaced by someone I barely knew, a woman who was passionate and knowledgeable and confident in her own thoughts. When the tall case clock in the corner chimed 4, he stood, signaling the end of our time. I felt a pang of disappointment so sharp it was like a physical ache. As I prepared to leave, he said, "I have a collection of original Palladio folios in the West Wing. Perhaps you would care to see them next week." It was not a question. It was a statement of intent. This was not a one-time curiosity. The next day, a package arrived from a stationer's on Bond Street. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a beautiful leather-bound sketchbook, its pages thick and creamy, and a full set of German drafting pencils sharpened to fine, precise points. There was no card, no note. There did not need to be. It was a gift that said, "I see you. I know what you value. Continue." I held the sketchbook to my chest, its smooth leather cool against my skin, and for the first time since my mother died, I wept. Not from sorrow, but from a terrifying, fragile joy. Our meetings became a regular occurrence, a quiet rebellion conducted under Isolde's furious but helpless gaze. She insisted on chaperoning, but the Duke had a subtle genius for neutralizing her. He would have Mrs. Gable escort her to a distant drawing room with the latest fashion magazines and a pot of her favorite oolong tea, leaving me and the Duke to our conversations in the library or the gallery. He called them our architectural consultations. He showed me his collection of folios, the original drawings of Wren and Jones, the intricate plans for buildings that were now cornerstones of the London landscape. He would spread them out on the vast library table, and we would lean over them together, our heads sometimes only inches apart. I would trace the lines with my finger, explaining my thoughts on the structural choices, and he would listen, interjecting with questions that were always sharp, always insightful. He treated my opinions with a gravity no one had ever afforded them. Section. I learned to read the subtle shifts in his severe expression. A slight narrowing of his eyes meant he was deeply considering a point. A faint upturn at the corner of his mouth was the equivalent of a broad smile from any other man. He was a man of immense stillness, but his mind was constantly in motion, and I found myself drawn into its powerful orbit. He began to talk about more than just buildings. He spoke of his estate in the north, Vane's End, a stark, windswept castle on a cliff overlooking the sea. He described its crumbling Norman keep, its drafty Tudor halls, its ill-advised Georgian additions. He spoke of it not with pride, but with a kind of weary frustration. It was a puzzle he could not solve. One rainy afternoon, as we looked over a set of my own sketches, designs for a theoretical library I had drawn in my new sketchbook, he grew unusually quiet. He stared at a drawing I had made of a flying buttress system, his face shadowed and grim. "This is very clever," he said, his voice rough. "The way you've distributed the thrust from the nave vaulting. It's elegant." He paused, his finger tracing the delicate pencil lines. My brother would have admired this. It was the first time he had mentioned his brother. The tragedy that had sent him into seclusion was a forbidden topic, a piece of society gossip no one dared broach in his presence. "His name was Arthur," the Duke said, his gaze distant, fixed on the rain lashing against the tall library windows. "He was younger than me by 5 years. He was the light in our family. Everyone loved him." He fell silent for a long moment. "He wanted to be an architect. He had a passion for it, the same fire I see in your work. He was brilliant, far more brilliant than I." I said nothing, merely listened, knowing this was a sacred confidence. "He designed a bridge on our estate," Alistair continued, his voice low and strained. "His first major commission. I funded it. I was impatient, proud of him. I pushed the builders to finish before the spring floods. I wanted to show him off. Arthur, he said they were cutting corners, that the footings needed more time to cure. I told him he was being overly cautious." His hand, resting on my sketch, clenched into a fist. "The floods came early that year. He was on the bridge, inspecting a joint when it gave way. The whole structure collapsed. They found his body 3 days later, miles downstream." The silence that followed was heavy with a guilt that was almost a physical presence in the room. I saw it then, the reason for his solitude, the source of the profound sadness in his eyes. He had built a fortress of silence and severity around himself to contain an agony he believed he deserved. The granite man was a facade hiding a wound that had never healed. Impulsively, I reached out and laid my hand over his clenched fist. It was a shocking breach of propriety, a gesture of comfort I had no right to offer. His hand was cold, rigid as stone. For a moment, I thought he would pull away, that I had gone too far. But he didn't. Instead, slowly, his fingers uncurled, turning to gently clasp mine. His touch was hesitant, almost questioning, but it sent a jolt of warmth through me that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. He looked at me, and for the first time, the walls in his pale gray eyes seemed to crumble. The severe Duke was gone, and in his place was just a man, haunted and broken. "He would have liked you," he whispered, his thumb brushing against my knuckles. "You would have talked for hours about groin vaults and fenestration." A near smile, a ghost of one, finally touched his lips. It transformed his harsh face, illuminating it from within. And in that moment, my careful, guarded heart did not just crack, It shattered completely. I was falling in love with this severe, sad, brilliant man, and the terror of it was matched only by its inevitability. We stayed like that for a long time, our hands clasped over my drawing of a theoretical building, the rain beating a somber rhythm against the glass, two solitary people finding a fragile sanctuary in a shared silence. The world, however, does not allow such sanctuaries to exist for long. Isolde watched our growing connection with the sharp, predatory gaze of a hawk circling a dove. She saw the Duke's closed carriage waiting for me twice a week. She saw the new books that arrived, the small, thoughtful gifts. She saw the subtle change in me, a straighter spine, a clearer voice, a light in my eyes she had worked so hard to extinguish. This was not part of her plan. Her plan involved marrying Rosalind to the aging, wealthy Marquis of Quenby, a union that would solve her own mounting financial problems, which I later learned were the result of a secret and ruinous gambling habit. My unexpected association with the most eligible man in the country was a complication she would not tolerate. She chose her moment to strike with tactical precision. I received a note from the Duke, a simple request to call upon him to view a newly acquired portfolio. I sent back my acceptance and spent the morning in a state of quiet anticipation. But when I came down the stairs, ready to depart, I found Isolde in the hall, her face a mask of sorrowful concern. "Elara, my dear child," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "I'm afraid you cannot go. I've already sent a note to the Duke explaining the situation and offering our deepest apologies." "What situation?" I asked, my heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat of dread. Your delicate condition," she said, dabbing at a dry eye with a lace handkerchief. "I've been worried about you for weeks. This sudden fixation on His Grace. It is not healthy. Your fancies are becoming more and more pronounced. I had to intervene. For your own good, and for his." I stared at her, uncomprehending. "Fancies? What are you talking about?" Her mask of concern hardened into its familiar cruelty. "I wrote to the Duke," she said, her voice now cold and sharp. "I explained that you are a troubled girl, prone to delusions. I told him of your obsessive nature, how you have constructed this entire relationship in your own mind. I told him you had become a danger to yourself and even to dear Rosalind, threatening her in a fit of jealousy." The floor seemed to drop away from beneath my feet. The lies were so monstrous, so grotesque, that I could not immediately process them. She had painted me as a madwoman, a pathetic, grasping creature lost in a world of fantasy. It was the masterstroke of her campaign against me, turning my one source of light into proof of my own darkness. "You didn't," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. "I did what was necessary," she snapped. "He is a man of honor. He will withdraw. He will leave you alone. It is a kindness, truly. I have saved you both from a great deal of embarrassment." She swept from the hall, leaving me standing there, the carefully constructed new world I had begun to inhabit, crashing down around me in silent, glittering shards. All the hope, all the fragile confidence evaporated. Of course he would believe her. She was Lady Atherton, a respected figure in society. I was the quiet, strange girl in the corner. Her narrative of my life was the one the world had always accepted. Why would the Duke be any different? He would see her letter as a confirmation of his own suspicions, that his interest had been a mistake, a misjudgment. The brief, beautiful interlude was over. I was invisible again. I turned and fled back to my room, the silence I returned to no longer a sanctuary but a tomb. For 2 days I existed in a gray fog of despair. I did not eat. I did not leave my room. I waited for the inevitable, a polite, final note from the Duke's secretary, formally severing all contact. But no note came. The silence from Vane House was absolute, and in its own way, more damning than a formal dismissal. He had simply erased me. Isolde left me to my misery, confident in her victory. On the morning of the 3rd day, the summons arrived. It was not a polite invitation. It was a command, written on the Duke's stiffest stationery, the Vane crest embossed in black wax. Lord Atherton, Lady Atherton, Miss Rosalind Atherton, and Miss Elara Atherton will present themselves at Vane House this afternoon at 2 o'clock. There was no room for refusal. The journey there was thick with a tense, anxious silence. Isolde was triumphant, believing this was the Duke's formal in-person confirmation of his withdrawal, a meeting to smooth over the social awkwardness she had created. My father was nervous, hating any form of confrontation. Rosalind was simply confused. And I was numb, a prisoner being led to her final sentencing. I had no fight left in me. We were not shown to the library or a pleasant salon. We were led by a grim-faced Mrs. Gable to the Duke's formal drawing room, a vast, cold chamber dominated by portraits of his severe-looking ancestors. The Duke was standing before the unlit fireplace, his back to us. He did not turn as we entered. He waited until the door had been closed by the footman, sealing us in. Then he turned. His face was carved from ice. The air in the room dropped several degrees. This was not the thoughtful intellectual I had come to know. This was the Duke of Vane in his full and terrible power. "Lady Atherton," he began, his voice devoid of any warmth. "2 days ago I received a letter from you, a letter filled with the most creative falsehoods." Isolde began to bluster, adopting her concerned parent persona. "Your Grace, I only wrote out of a mother's love and fear for a troubled child." "Be silent," he said. The 2 words cut through her speech like a shard of glass. She flinched as if struck, her mouth snapping shut. He took a step forward, holding a sheaf of papers in his hand. "You claimed in your letter that Miss Atherton is prone to delusions. My own observations suggest she is one of the most lucid and intellectually honest people I have ever met. You claimed she is obsessed. I would characterize her conduct as reserved, dignified, and entirely appropriate. You claimed she threatened her sister." He paused, his gaze flicking to Rosalind, who looked pale and bewildered. "Is this true, Miss Rosalind? Did your sister threaten you?" Rosalind looked at her mother, then at me, her expression torn. "No," she said, her voice small but clear. "Never. Elara has never been anything but kind to me." The Duke gave a slight nod as if confirming a fact he already knew. "Interesting. Because the most egregious lie in your letter, Lady Atherton, was the one you told by omission. The lie about your motive." He stepped toward my father, who shrank back. "Lord Atherton, are you aware that your wife has accumulated gambling debts in excess of £20,000? My father's face went slack with shock. "Are you aware," the Duke continued, his voice relentless, "that for the past 5 years she has been paying these debts by systematically embezzling funds from the trust left to your daughter Elara by her late mother?" He held up one of the papers. It was a bank draft. "This is a withdrawal for £500 made last month. The signature purports to be Miss Elara Atherton's. I had it examined by a handwriting expert. It is a forgery, a rather clumsy one at that." He dropped the paper onto a table where it landed with a soft, damning slap. The room was utterly silent save for Isolde's ragged breathing. Her face had collapsed, the mask of gentility dissolving to reveal the raw, desperate greed beneath. She was exposed, stripped bare under his cold, analytical gaze. "Your plan was quite simple," the Duke stated, his voice ablade. "Marry your daughter to a rich man to solve your debt crisis and ensure Miss Atherton, the rightful heir to a modest but significant fortune, remained too timid, too broken, and too isolated to ever claim what was hers. My interest in her was a threat to that plan. So you tried to destroy her character, you underestimated her, and you greatly, greatly underestimated me." He had not raised his voice once. His calm, systematic destruction of her was far more terrifying than any rant. He had taken her web of lies and torn it to shreds with the simple, brutal force of the truth. Then he turned his eyes to me. The ice in them melted, replaced by a look of quiet expectation. "Miss Atherton," he said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly, "is there anything you would like to say?" All eyes were on me. Isolde shot me a look of pure hatred. My father looked ashamed, broken. Rosalind looked at me with dawning horror and pity. For 10 years I had been silent. I had swallowed the cruelty, absorbed the insults, and accepted the role of the invisible girl. But standing there, in the circle of this man's fierce, unwavering belief in me, I found a voice I did not know I possessed. I looked directly at my stepmother. You did not do it for money, I said, my voice steady and clear, ringing with a strength that surprised even me. The money was a convenience. You did it because you could not bear the idea of anything belonging solely to me. Not my mother's memory, not my own thoughts, not a single moment of quiet happiness. You wanted me to be nothing, so you could be everything. You tried to make me believe your voice was my own conscience, that my worthlessness was a fact of nature. But you are not a force of nature, Isolde. You are just a small, cruel woman. And I am done listening to you. The silence that followed my words was absolute. I had not shouted. I had not wept. I had simply spoken my truth. And it was enough. Isolde crumpled, all the fight gone out of her, her face a ruin of malice and defeat. My father finally spoke, his voice choked with a shame that was a decade too late. Elara, I'm sorry. Rosalind crossed the room and took my hand, her own trembling. I'm so sorry, she whispered, her eyes full of tears. I never saw. I should have seen. The Duke watched this unfold, then gave a curt nod to Mrs. Gable, who was waiting by the door. My solicitor will be in contact with you, Lord Atherton, to arrange the full restitution of Miss Atherton's inheritance, with interest. As for you, Lady Atherton, I would advise you to find a very quiet place in the country to reside. You will find London's doors are now permanently closed to you. He had not just defeated her, he had banished her. He dismissed them with a wave of his hand, and they shuffled out of the room, a broken, disgraced family. And then I was alone with him. The aftermath of the storm was a profound, echoing silence. I stood in the middle of the vast room, shaking with adrenaline and a dizzying sense of release. The chains I had worn for a decade had been shattered. I felt light, untethered, and utterly terrified. Alistair came to me then, crossing the space between us. He stopped before me, his expression no longer severe, but filled with a deep, unguarded tenderness. He gently took my hands in his. They were still cold. Are you all right? He asked, his voice low. I could only nod, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. He looked down at our joined hands. They told you that you were too much, he said softly, his words a direct balm on the oldest of my wounds. Too quiet, too thoughtful, too much of a burden to be loved. They were wrong. He looked up, his pale gray eyes meeting mine, and their intensity was a vow. I find, Elara, that you are not nearly enough. I would have the rest of my life to discover the rest of you. My breath hitched. This was not a declaration born of pity or a desire to rescue me. It was a statement of profound want, a need that mirrored the burgeoning ache in my own soul. Your family saw your mind as a threat, he continued, his thumb tracing a slow circle on the back of my hand. I see it as the most beautiful thing about you. They saw your resilience as stubbornness. I see it as a strength that puts steel to shame. They tried to make you invisible, and in doing so, only made you shine brighter to anyone with the sense to truly look. He took a step closer, his presence a warm, solid anchor in the swirling chaos of my emotions. I am not a man for pretty words, Elara. I have lived in silence and shadow for a long time. But you are like the principles of architecture you so admire. You are full of light and truth and an elegant, unadorned beauty. I do not wish to be your rescuer. I wish to be your partner, to build a life with you, founded on respect and trust. I want to stand beside you and watch you claim the world you deserve. He released one of my hands to gently cup my face, his touch sending a tremor through my entire being. Elara Atherton, he said, his voice rough with an emotion he no longer tried to conceal. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Tears I had refused to shed in front of my tormentors now streamed freely down my cheeks. They were tears of catharsis, of disbelief, of a joy so vast and overwhelming it was painful. Yes, I whispered, Alistair, yes. The name felt right on my tongue, a key turning in a lock I hadn't known existed. He searched my face, and seeing the absolute certainty in my eyes, he lowered his head and kissed me. It was not a tentative, questioning kiss. It was a kiss of profound certainty, of arrival. It was warm and deep and tasted of solace and promises. It was the end of a very long, very cold winter and the first, breathtaking dawn of spring. 1 year later, I stood on the windswept battlements of Vane's End, the the Duchess of Vane. The salty air whipped my hair across my face, and the cry of the gulls echoed from the cliffs below. The crumbling Norman keep behind me was no longer crumbling. Scaffolding still clung to its sides, but the stones had been reset, the mortar fresh. The great hall no longer felt drafty, its windows reglazed, its tapestries restored. The castle was slowly, carefully being brought back to life. Alistair came to stand beside me, wrapping a strong arm around my waist and pulling me into the warmth of his greatcoat. He followed my gaze to the new bridge that spanned the chasm where his brothers had once stood. It was a soaring arch of pale stone and elegant ironwork, a design born from my sketchbook and his practical, demanding engineering knowledge. It was our first joint project. We had named it the Arthur Bridge. "The light is fading," he murmured into my hair. "We should go inside." I leaned back against his solid chest, content and at peace. My father, humbled and repentant, was slowly rebuilding his relationship with me, writing weekly. Rosalind, now married to a kind young baronet she had chosen herself, had become my closest friend and confidant. As for Isolde, she was a ghost, a bad memory, living in forced, impoverished exile somewhere in Bath. Her power over me was broken, her voice a faint, meaningless echo. "Just a moment longer," I said, looking at the plans I held in my hand, the initial sketches for the new wing of the local orphanage we were funding. My name was in the corner, Elara Vane, architect. Alistair had not given me a voice. He had not rescued a damsel from a tower. He had simply walked into my prison of silence, looked at me with clear, intelligent eyes, and asked a question. He had recognized the person I already was, hidden beneath layers of fear and neglect. He had created a space of safety and respect where I could finally find the courage to speak in my own voice, to be the woman I was always meant to be. They had told me I was too much to love, a burden to be hidden away. But he, my husband, had looked at the quiet, intellectual core of my being and said it wasn't nearly enough. He wanted more. He wanted all of me. And in his love, I had finally become not invisible, but infinite.